Welcome to Session 4, Motivation and Creativity. In this presentation, you will be provided with a basic overview of the different types of motivation and how they can influence instances of creativity. Let's start by defining motivation. Motivation can have many different definitions, and it is often synonymous with drive, inspiration, dedication, and passion. At its heart, motivation is the present act of striving towards the future or being driven from the past by individual desires, fears, and beliefs about ourselves and our relationship to the world around us. Let's start by exploring extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is a type of motivation that leverages rewards like money or recognition or power as a way to achieve particular outcomes. Now, for this type of motivation to be effective, the reward has to be desirable. It also has to be attainable. Students will not be motivated extrinsically if they believe that nothing they can do would earn the reward. But rewards must also be exclusive. If everyone is able to get them, then they're no longer considered to be desirable. And then finally, rewards have to be based on specific criteria. So, in order to engage in the game, students must know the rules of the game, how to win, and how to avoid losing. There are three distinct drivers of extrinsic motivation. One is power and prestige. This could be as simple as making a student a hall monitor or putting them in a leadership role among a team of students or their peers. Another driver might be rewards. Now, generally, it's not monetary rewards in the school system, but there are instances of that. But rewards could also be simple gifts up to large gifts that reward a certain behavior or meeting of a goal. Then finally, there's recognition, and this could be awards, it could be trophies, anything that is exclusive and indicates that this student or group of students won a competition against their peers. I've decided to characterize the extrinsic approach to motivating others as the commander because it uses rewards and reprimands, it checks for compliance, and often uses checklists or even rubrics to outline behavior. Now, to speak the language of extrinsic motivation, you have to provide specific instructions and goals. Instantaneous feedback is key because students are trying to drive towards the right answer or the specific type of behavior that you're looking for. Training is always focused on what they need to know in order to meet that goal. You should be removing obstacles that prevent people from meeting the goal, or as I'm calling it here, winning. There should be data or tools that are accessible that allow the student to know how they're progressing. And then finally, your communication should be consistent. Should always go back to the rules that you initially outlined, because any deviation from that initial rule set will throw off and demotivate students. Now, extrinsic motivation only works in certain instances and comes with pros and cons. It can drive productivity and efficiency and ensure a consistency of result. It can also quickly motivate change, get very specific outcomes, and be a clear positive indicator of behavior. Some of the cons is that it can be costly, especially if you're using rewards or rewards. It gets to the point where students won't do something unless they're rewarded to do it. It can diminish critical thinking because the student simply wants to please you or meet the goal that you outlined. It may even decrease initiative. As I mentioned, if you're not actively rewarding, students may not demonstrate the behavior that you're looking for. It can also stifle creativity because people are focused on getting the reward. This is particularly true in the workplace where bonuses can drive less creative behavior because people are so afraid of thinking outside the box and losing that potential for the bonus. And then any change made in the behavior may not be permanent. Again, it's tied to the reward that you give. So extrinsic motivation should be used for reinforcing rote behaviors and therefore increasing the quantity of output on simple tasks. Let's move on to intrinsic motivation, what I refer to as task-focused motivation. In contrast to extrinsic motivation, intrinsic motivation is characterized by an intense focus on and personal connection with a particular task or discipline. Now, for this type of motivation to be effective, the task has to be interesting. It has to challenge our existing skills, but it also has to be achievable. More importantly, people must have the freedom to complete the task in their own way and must feel that they have genuine personal responsibility for the outcome. If students don't feel like their input makes a material difference to the project, then this type of motivation will not be triggered. As I alluded to in the previous slide, there are three key drivers to intrinsic motivation. It must be challenging, it must match our skills and stretch them. It has to be interesting, it must hold our attention. And then finally, it has to be engaging, meaning we can influence the outcome. That statement of having skin in the game. And if there's no skin in the game, then this type of motivation is not triggered. The image I selected for intrinsic motivation is the patron, because this approach keeps students accountable to the end goal, it guides rather than manages, and it encourages rather than reprimands. Now, to speak the language of intrinsic motivation, you must first create a compelling vision of the outcome. You must empower students to get there, and then ensure they understand that they have the skills to meet whatever challenge they may face along the way. And you must emphasize their role in bringing about the outcome. So you're asking a lot of those big questions here, the why, the how, the who. Whereas with extrinsic motivation, it's only about the what. While intrinsic motivation may seem more effective than extrinsic motivation, like extrinsic motivation, it is limited to certain applications. Some of the pros of intrinsic motivation are that students take ownership without relying entirely on rewards. Students will innovate to improve their experience of the task, and their love can be contagious for their peers and maybe younger students. Now, some of the cons is students can lose themselves in the task and really not want to collaborate with others. They become very possessive. And if the task is no longer interesting or there are aspects of the task that are not interesting, intrinsic motivation loses its power. Therefore, this type of motivation should be used for tasks requiring decision making and problem solving. Let's move on to the final type of motivation, autotelic motivation, or what I refer to as internally focused motivation. Many of you will not be familiar with this type of motivation, and this is because it is a relatively new concept, which I have found through my research. In my studies on motivation, I have found that extrinsic and intrinsic motivation do not capture the entire spectrum of human motivation. Therefore, I have endeavored to explore a third way. In contrast to extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, extrinsic being focused on the reward or the outcome, intrinsic being focused on the task, autotelic motivation is characterized by an intense desire for belonging and purpose, and the willingness to connect a part of our very selves to the world around us. Now, for this type of motivation to be effective, we must understand ourselves, first and foremost. We must believe that we can make a positive impact. not just on a particular task, but on the world around us. The mission and role must resonate with what we value and believe about ourselves and the world. And our work should be the intersection of our abilities and our personal purpose. Now, autotelic, the word, really comes from the Greek meaning auto, self, and telic or telos, end. So think about this motivation as the self being an end in and of itself rather than the task or the reward. Here are some key drivers to autotelic motivation. Belief. This is who I should be. Purpose. This is what I should be doing. And self-expression. This reflects who I really am. When you think about autotelic motivation, it is incredibly individualized. It is the outgrowth of intense reflection about who we are and what we believe, as evidenced by these drivers. I characterize this approach to motivating others as the Ford maker. So imagine a person, a guide on one side of a river or ford, and they help other people to the other side, but they themselves stay back and don't go on to the other side so that they can help more people get over to the other side. The Ford maker, or this approach, helps students discover and build their strengths, respects their individual experience, provides ways for them to express their gifts, connects their personal goals to community values, and gives students opportunities to formulate and articulate their purpose. Now you can already see that this is going to have different application in different age groups. This is going to be a lot harder to do in a kindergarten or first grade than it may be to do in high school. Now, speaking the language of autotelic motivation involves communicating in terms of values, providing a view of the big pictures so that students understand where they fit in, and discussing the implications of what they're doing and how they're making a difference, going beyond just their grades and tests. As with the other types of motivations, autotelic motivation has pros and cons. But I believe that autotelic motivation holds the greatest potential for creativity and creative thinking because it energizes by leveraging natural desire for self-determination. Students need little oversight. They will innovate in unforeseen ways because they have that freedom. It increases a student's desire and ability to identify and solve problems. It drives deep commitment. And achievement is independent of reward or even enjoyment. Because if a student, or a person for that matter, believes this is what they should be doing, then the small challenges, or even the large ones, that they encounter along the way will not dissuade them from this belief, in most instances. Now, some of the cons. It must be supported culturally, and we're driven by a standardized testing model, and it's very difficult to incorporate this type of motivation and trigger this type of motivation within the prevailing culture in our schools. It takes time to realize the benefits. This is something that would span grade levels, not be something that could be accomplished in one lesson. It requires a unique set of pedagogical skills. Again, with moving from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation, we move from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. Well, this is being a guide right by their side. And there's certain environments that would work in. Standard goals can undermine this type of motivation because you're driving students to one outcome that is the same for everyone. And then if led by another person, if you try to act in this student's stead and build a purpose for them, it can lead to negative emotions and behaviors. So autotelic motivation should be used in areas that benefit from compassion, commitment, and innovative thinking. And again, this is why I think this is a key type of motivation that isn't captured in extrinsic and intrinsic motivation that can lead to greater instances of creativity and creative thinking. Here are some final thoughts on motivation that I would like you to consider. There is an ethical component to motivation because students are an end in of themselves and not just a means for funding or a means for scores on tests. So when using motivation, equity of result should be focused on, and not equity of approach. What I mean by that is one size does not fit all. If we want all students to be engaged, how we engage them will be different. Identify unintended consequences, especially when using extrinsic motivation. Be cognizant of incentivizing the wrong or undesired outcomes. Be consistent in your communication. So eradicate or align competing goals. Use extrinsic motivation sparingly because it can lead to codependence. If students only do because you reward, then we're not setting them up to think independently and take responsibility for their actions and outcomes. Encourage personal ownership of tasks. Give students the tools and support and guidance they need to succeed. Be ethical in your choice of motivators. Again, extrinsic motivation usually can get results very quickly, but those results don't last, and there may often be unintended consequences with using that approach. Respect those around you. Remember that students are an end in of themselves and shouldn't simply be treated as a means to an end. But I realize that we all have goals that we must meet, but we must remember in the midst of that chaos that students are not means to an end, but an end in and of themselves. And then finally, find what motivates you. It's hard for you to trigger intrinsic motivation and autotelic motivation in your students if you haven't been able to do that for yourself. So I encourage you to review this presentation and think about your personal purpose and think about the times in your life where you've been the most creative and why that's the case. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation. I look forward to your comments on the discussion board for this week.